Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We're everywhere. Cities, farms, mountains, deserts. We've built skyscrapers, sent rockets to Mars, created the internet. We dominate this planet like no species ever has. But rewind the clock 70,000 years, and the picture would have been terrifyingly different. Somewhere in Africa, scattered across a landscape of ash and dying forests, roughly 2,000 humans struggle to survive. Not 2 million, not 200,000, just 2,000 individuals. The entire future of humanity, everything we would ever become, all of it dependent on this tiny, desperate group holding on through conditions that had already killed off countless other populations. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check comments and it's wild. Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, Elsey at midnight, all watching the same story about how we almost weren't here to watch anything at all. Think about that number for a second. 2,000 people. That's smaller than most high schools, smaller than the population of a typical small town. You could fit every single human ancestor alive at that moment into a couple of movie theaters, and there'd still be empty seats. The entire genetic diversity of humanity, everything that makes 8 billion of us different from each other today, all of it compressed into a gene pool so small that everyone probably knew everyone else, or at least knew someone who knew them. And here's the thing that should keep you up at night, or in this case, help you drift off contemplating it. We almost didn't make it. Whatever happened 70,000 years ago, it came within a hair's breadth of ending the human story before it really began. For decades, this was just a theory, a mathematical whisper hidden in our DNA that scientists couldn't quite make sense of. They knew something had happened. Our genetic diversity is weirdly low compared to other species. Chimpanzees, who live in scattered groups across a fraction of the territory humans occupy, have way more genetic variation than all 8 billion of us combined. That's not normal. That's the signature of something catastrophic. But nobody knew exactly what had happened or how close we'd actually come to the edge. Not until geneticists started reading our DNA like a history book written in molecules, tracing mutations backward through time, generation by generation, millennium by millennium. What they found was stunning. The genetic evidence shows that roughly 70,000 years ago, the human population crashed to perhaps as few as 2,000 breeding individuals. Maybe it was 3,000, maybe 1,500. The exact number is debated, but all the evidence points to the same terrifying conclusion. For several thousand years, humanity was balanced on a knife's edge. One bad drought, one epidemic, one unlucky winter away from joining the long list of species that simply vanished. And the truly mind-bending part? Every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, we're all descendants of those survivors. Every human being you've ever met, every face you've seen in a crowd, every person in every photo throughout history, all of us carry the DNA of that tiny population that refused to die when the world was trying its hardest to kill them. This isn't ancient mythology. This is written in our genes. It's forensic evidence of the most important survival story in human history. The question that haunts scientists is simple but profound. What happened? What could have pushed humanity to the absolute brink of extinction? What kind of catastrophe could wipe out human populations across entire continents, reducing our ancestors to a few thousand frightened survivors huddled together in some last refuge? The answer, as we'll discover, involves one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in the last million years, a global climate catastrophe that plunged the Earth into years of volcanic winter, and a small group of humans who somehow, against all odds, found a way to endure. This is the story of how 2,000 people saved humanity from extinction. It's a detective story written in genetic code. It's a survival tale that makes every disaster movie look tame by comparison, and it's absolutely real. The evidence is locked in your DNA right now. Molecular scars from a catastrophe so severe that it shaped every aspect of what it means to be human. So let's go back, way back, to the moment when humanity's flame nearly went out and somehow, impossibly, kept burning. Here's something that should keep you awake at night, even though we're trying to help you sleep. If you took DNA samples from two chimpanzees living on opposite sides of Africa, separated by thousands of miles, never having met, never having any connection whatsoever, their genetic difference would be greater than the difference between any two humans alive today. Let that sink in for a moment. Two random chimps are more genetically diverse than a person from Iceland and a person from New Zealand. More diverse than someone from the Amazon rainforest and someone from the Mongolian steppes. This doesn't make sense. Humans are everywhere. We've spread across every continent, adapted to every climate from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. We should be incredibly diverse. We should show massive genetic variation between populations, but we don't. For decades, this puzzle haunted geneticists. Why were humans so genetically similar? The answer, when it finally came, was terrifying. We're all closely related because we nearly went extinct. All of us, every human alive today, descends from a tiny population that survived when everyone else died. The discovery started in the 1980s, when scientists began analyzing mitochondrial DNA. This is genetic material that passes from mothers to children, unchanged except for rare mutations. By counting these mutations, geneticists can work backward through time, building family trees that span millennia. What they found was shocking. When they traced all human mitochondrial DNA back to its source, everything converged on a single woman who lived in Africa sometime between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The media called her Mitochondrial Eve, though that's misleading. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time, but she was the only woman whose maternal line survived to the present day. Then came the Y chromosome studies. This genetic material passes from fathers to sons, creating another kind of family tree. The results were even more disturbing. All human Y chromosomes trace back to a single man, Y chromosomal Adam, who lived sometime between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Again, he wasn't the only man alive, but he was the only man whose paternal line didn't go extinct. These findings told geneticists something profound. At some point in our past, the human population had crashed so catastrophically that only a tiny fraction of lineages survived. This is what scientists call a genetic bottleneck. When a population crashes, it doesn't just lose numbers, it loses genetic diversity. Imagine you have a bag containing 1,000 different colored marbles. Now imagine you reach in and pull out just 10 marbles at random. Those 10 marbles don't represent the full diversity of what was in the bag. Lots of colors just eliminated. That's what happened to humanity. But mitochondrial and Y chromosome data only told part of the story. They tracked single lineages, maternal and paternal lines. To understand the full picture, geneticists needed to analyze the entire genome, all the DNA that makes us who we are. When they did, starting in the early 2000s with increasingly sophisticated genetic sequencing technology, the evidence became overwhelming. Humans had gone through not just one bottleneck, but possibly several. And one of them was devastating. The genetic signatures are everywhere once you know how to look. One of the clearest markers is something called linkage disequilibrium. In normal populations, genetic variants get shuffled and recombined every generation through sexual reproduction. Over time, this creates a random distribution of traits. But in bottlenecked populations, this shuffling process gets interrupted. Genetic variants that happen to be present in the survivors stay linked together for thousands of generations. creating patterns that persist to the present day. Human DNA is full of these patterns, fossil evidence of ancient population crashes written in our genes. Another signature is in our mutation load. Every human carries dozens of slightly harmful genetic mutations. In large populations, natural selection efficiently removes these mutations over time. But in small populations, random chance becomes more important than selection. Harmful mutations can spread just because they happen to be in the survivors, not because they provide any advantage. The number and distribution of harmful mutations in human DNA suggests we spent a very long time as a very small population, small enough that random genetic drift overwhelmed natural selection. Then there's the famous chromosome 2 fusion. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 24 pairs. Somewhere in our evolutionary past, 2 chromosomes fused together, and this fusion became fixed in the entire human population. For that to happen, the population carrying the fusion had to be extremely small. In a large, diverse population, a major chromosomal change like this would be unlikely to spread. But in a tiny bottlenecked population, it could become universal within a few generations. By the 2010s, geneticists had developed sophisticated computational models that could analyze these signatures and estimate ancient population sizes. The results were remarkably consistent across different research groups using different methods. Sometime between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, possibly around 70,000 years ago, the effective breeding population of humans dropped to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals. Some studies suggested numbers as low as 2,000. A few argued for populations under 1,000. Now, effective breeding population is important to understand. It doesn't mean the total number of humans alive. It means the number of individuals actually reproducing and passing on genes to the next generation. In any population, some people die before reproducing. Some are too young or too old to have children. Some are infertile. The effective population is always smaller than the total population, sometimes much smaller. So if the effective breeding population was 2,000, the actual number of living humans might have been 5,000, maybe 10,000. But that's still terrifyingly small. Think about it this way. There are more people in a large shopping mall on a Saturday afternoon than there were humans on the entire planet during the bottleneck. The whole species could have fit into a modern sports stadium with room to spare. For a species that now numbers 8 billion, that's almost incomprehensible. But the debate among geneticists wasn't over. Some researchers questioned whether the genetic evidence really showed a single catastrophic bottleneck or a longer period of small population size. Others suggested the apparent bottleneck might reflect population structure rather than actual size. Maybe humans were divided into small isolated groups that rarely interbred, creating genetic patterns that looked like a bottleneck, even though the total population was larger. These debates continue. Science rarely offers absolute certainty, especially when reconstructing events that happened tens of thousands of years ago. But the core finding remains solid. At some point in our past, humans came terrifyingly close to extinction. Our genetic diversity crashed, and we've never fully recovered. Every person alive today carries the genetic signature of that ancient near-death experience. It's written in our DNA, an invisible scar from a catastrophe so severe that only the tiniest fraction of our ancestors survived. The question that haunted researchers next was simple but crucial. What caused it? What could have driven humanity to the very edge of extinction? The answer, when it came, pointed to an event so catastrophic that it nearly ended human history before it really began. Picture the Indonesian island of Sumatra, 74,000 years ago. The sun rises over a landscape of tropical forests, rivers teeming with fish, and a massive lake surrounded by volcanic peaks. Your distant ancestors might have lived hundreds or thousands of miles away, but what's about to happen here will determine whether they survive or join the countless extinct species that came before them. Deep beneath that lake, something has been building for thousands of years. Magma, superheated rock under unimaginable pressure, has been accumulating in a chamber the size of a small mountain. The Earth's crust above it is weakening, fracturing, ready to give way. Then, one morning, it happens. The explosion is beyond anything in human experience. Not just bigger than any volcanic eruption you've seen in documentaries, bigger than anything that's happened in the last 2 million years of Earth's history. Mount Toba doesn't just erupt. It tears itself apart. Within hours, maybe minutes, 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and magma are blasted into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, that's enough material to bury the entire United Kingdom under 12 meters of volcanic debris. It's 5,000 times larger than the Mount St. Helens eruption. It's 100 times larger than the eruption of Krakatoa, which killed 36,000 people and was heard 3,000 miles away. The sound of Toba's eruption probably traveled around the entire planet multiple times. The blast creates a column of superheated gas and debris that punches through the atmosphere, reaching heights of 50 kilometers or more. That's 3 times higher than commercial jets fly. The column is so massive, so energetic, that it begins to collapse under its own weight, sending pyroclastic flows racing across the landscape at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Everything within 100 kilometers is instantly incinerated. Forests that have stood for millennia are reduced to ash in seconds. Rivers boil away. Mountains are buried under hundreds of meters of volcanic debris. But that's just the beginning. The eruption column spreads outward, carried by upper atmospheric winds. Within days, ash begins falling across South Asia. Not a light dusting, but meters of it, burying everything. Archaeological sites in India show ash layers from Toba, up to 6 meters thick, deposited thousands of kilometers from the eruption site. Imagine being one of those early humans living in India when the ash starts falling. First, you see the sky darken, not gradually like a sunset, but rapidly, ominously. Within hours, it's darker than any night you've ever experienced. The sun is gone, hidden behind a thickening veil of volcanic aerosols. Then the ash begins to fall. Fine gray powder that gets into everything, your eyes, your lungs, your food, your water. It coats the leaves that animals eat. It poisons the rivers. It blocks out the sun so completely that plants begin to die within weeks. Your group tries to survive, but the ash keeps falling, day after day, week after week. The landscape you knew, the forests and grasslands you depended on, they're vanishing under a gray blanket of death. And you're thousands of kilometers from the eruption. You have no idea what caused this, no understanding that a mountain half a world away has just tried to kill every living thing on the planet. The ash eventually reaches Africa, your ancestors' last refuge. Not as thick as in India, but enough to disrupt ecosystems, enough to add one more catastrophic stress to populations already struggling to survive. But the ash is just the immediate crisis. What comes next is worse. Those volcanic aerosols, the fine particles and sulfur dioxide pumped into the stratosphere, they begin spreading across the entire planet. Within months, they've circled the globe, creating a reflective layer that bounces sunlight back into space before it can reach the surface. The planet begins to cool. This is what scientists call a volcanic winter, not a nuclear winter, though the effects are similar. The mechanism is the same. Block out the sun, and the Earth's temperature plummets. The cooling happens fast. Within the first year after the eruption, global average temperatures might have dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In some regions, particularly in the northern hemisphere, the drop could have been much more severe, 10 degrees or more. That might not sound like much, but consider this. The difference between current global temperatures and the depths of the last ice age is only about 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. Toba potentially created an instant ice age that lasted for years. The first winter after the eruption would have been catastrophic. Growing seasons shortened dramatically or disappeared entirely. In higher latitudes, snow that fell in autumn didn't melt in spring. It just kept accumulating year after year, building ice sheets that wouldn't fully retreat for millennia. In the tropics, where your ancestors were struggling to survive, the effects were different but equally devastating. Rainfall patterns collapsed. The monsoons that brought life-giving rains to Africa and Asia weakened or failed entirely. Rivers shrank to trickles. Lakes dried up. The grasslands that had been slowly recovering from the longer climate crisis began dying again. For 6 to 10 years, maybe longer, the sun was a dim disk barely visible through the haze. Temperatures remained below normal. Plants that needed sunlight to photosynthesize struggled or died. The animals that depended on those plants starved. The predators that depended on those animals starved. And the humans who depended on the entire ecosystem, they were pushed to the absolute edge of extinction. The evidence for this catastrophe is written in multiple independent records. Ice cores from Greenland show a sharp spike in sulfate deposits right around 74,000 years ago, the chemical signature of massive volcanic eruption. Ocean sediment cores from the Indian Ocean contain thick layers of Toba ash, precisely dated and chemically fingerprinted to the eruption. Most tellingly, some researchers point to genetic evidence. Remember that population bottleneck we discussed earlier? Some scientists argue that it coincides almost perfectly with the Toba eruption. They suggest that the volcanic winter was the final catastrophic blow to human populations, already weakened by long-term climate deterioration. The theory goes like this. Humans had already been struggling for tens of thousands of years due to the general climate crisis. Populations were fragmented, reduced, barely hanging on. Then Toba erupted, and what was already a desperate situation became apocalyptic. In Africa, where the surviving human populations were concentrated, the volcanic winter would have turned marginal habitats into death zones. Groups that had been managing to survive by exploiting coastal resources, hunting in grassland refuges, or living near permanent water sources suddenly found those resources disappearing. Coastal populations might have been somewhat protected. Ocean temperatures don't drop as quickly as land temperatures, and marine ecosystems are more resistant to short-term atmospheric changes. If you were living near the coast, eating shellfish, catching fish, you might have had a better chance than inland groups. But even coastal survival would have been brutally difficult. With temperatures dropping and rainfall failing, even the most resilient ecosystems would have been stressed. Competition for remaining resources would have intensified. Groups that had coexisted peacefully might have been forced into conflict over dwindling food supplies. This is when the real selection happened. Not just physical survival skills, but cognitive and social abilities became critical. Groups that could innovate quickly, that could shift their diet when traditional foods disappeared, that could maintain cooperation under extreme stress. Those were the groups that made it through. Groups that were too rigid, too specialized, too dependent on specific resources or strategies. They died out, and with them died entire lineages of human genetic diversity. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because as dramatic as the Toba eruption was, and as compelling as the volcanic winter theory sounds, the evidence isn't as clear-cut as you might think. Some researchers have challenged the catastrophe narrative. They point out that the genetic bottleneck might have started before Toba, or lasted longer than the volcanic winter. They note that archaeological sites in India show continued human occupation right through the ash layers, suggesting at least some population survived the immediate aftermath. Ice core data shows the cooling, yes, but some studies suggest it was less severe or shorter-lived than the most extreme estimates. Maybe 3 to 4 years of significant cooling rather than a decade or more. Still catastrophic, but possibly survivable for groups that were already adapted to harsh conditions. Other scientists argue that the real killer wasn't Toba itself, but the combination of Toba and the ongoing climate crisis. The volcanic winter was just one more hammer blow to populations already reeling from tens of thousands of years of environmental stress. It didn't cause the bottleneck so much as accelerate and intensify it. There's also evidence that different regions were affected differently. Areas downwind of the eruption, particularly South and Southeast Asia, suffered catastrophic ashfall and probably experienced massive population die-offs or complete extinction of human groups. But Africa, while affected by the volcanic winter, might have been somewhat protected by its distance from the eruption. What we can say with confidence is this: around 74,000 years ago, the Earth experienced the largest volcanic eruption in 2 million years. This eruption had global effects, depositing ash across continents and likely causing significant climate cooling for several years. And around the same time, within the margin of error of our dating methods, human populations crashed to levels that brought our species within a few thousand individuals of extinction. Whether Toba caused the bottleneck, contributed to it, or merely coincided with it, the result was the same. Your ancestors found themselves living in a world that had become actively hostile to human life, a world where the sun was dim, the temperature was falling, and the food was running out. But somehow, somewhere, approximately 2,000 of them held on. Through the volcanic winter and the decades of disrupted climate that followed. Through the starvation and the cold and the endless struggle just to see another sunrise, they held on, and in holding on, they saved humanity. But here's where our story hits a snag, a major one, because not everyone agrees that Toba nearly wiped us out. In fact, some of the most prominent scientists studying this period think the whole catastrophe theory is exaggerated at best, completely wrong at worst, and they've got evidence. Let's start with the most obvious problem. If Toba created a nuclear winter that lasted years, maybe decades, if it reduced global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, if it killed vegetation across vast regions and triggered mass starvation, we should see it everywhere in the archaeological record. Every human site dating to 74,000 years ago should show a sudden break. Tools should disappear, settlements should be abandoned. The signs of human activity should just stop for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. But that's not what we find. In 2007, a team of archaeologists working at a site called Wallapuram in southern India made a discovery that threw the entire Toba catastrophe theory into question. They found stone tools, lots of them, below the Toba ash layer, throughout the ash layer, and above it. The same stone tool tradition, unchanged, continuing right through the eruption without any apparent interruption. Think about what that means. These people were living less than 2,000 miles from the eruption, close enough that volcanic ash buried their living sites under several inches of debris. If anywhere was going to show evidence of catastrophic human population collapse, it should have been here. But the tools tell a different story. The same techniques, the same designs, the same evidence of human presence before, during, and after the eruption. No break, no gap, no sign that anything catastrophic had happened at all. The archaeologists found similar patterns at other sites across India. Wherever they looked, human activities seemed to continue through the Toba eruption relatively unchanged, not just surviving, but maintaining their cultural traditions, their tool-making techniques, their ways of life. In Africa, the evidence is even more problematic for the catastrophe theory. Remember, Africa is where the genetic bottleneck supposedly hit hardest. where human populations were reduced to a few thousand individuals scattered across scattered refuges, where the majority of our species was supposed to have died out. But archaeological sites from this period tell a more complicated story. In South Africa, sites like Pinnacle Point show continuous human occupation right through 74,000 years ago. The inhabitants were eating shellfish, making sophisticated tools, using pigments for what might have been symbolic purposes. There's no sign of sudden population collapse, no evidence of desperate survival conditions. Further north, sites in East Africa show similar continuity. Stone tool traditions don't break. There's no massive die-off visible in the archaeological record. Human populations seem to have continued doing what they'd been doing for tens of thousands of years, adapting to environmental changes but not facing extinction. Now, you might think, okay, maybe the archaeological evidence isn't complete. Maybe we're just not finding the sites where people died off. Maybe the survivors left more visible traces than the victims. Fair point. Except the climate data is starting to tell a similar story. When scientists first modeled the Toba eruption, they used relatively simple climate models. They assumed the volcanic aerosols would spread evenly through the atmosphere, blocking sunlight globally, creating a uniform cooling effect. That's how you get those terrifying estimates of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius cooling worldwide. Years of volcanic winter, global vegetation collapse. But more recent climate modeling has gotten a lot more sophisticated. Scientists can now account for wind patterns, ocean currents, regional variations, and how aerosols spread and settle. And these new models paint a very different picture. Yes, Toba was catastrophic. No question. It was the largest eruption in the past 2 million years. It put enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. It definitely caused cooling. But the cooling might have been much more localized than originally thought, and much shorter-lived. A 2018 study used advanced climate models to simulate the Toba eruption's atmospheric effects. Their results suggested that while regions near the eruption site would have experienced severe cooling, possibly lasting several years, areas farther away, including much of Africa, might have seen temperature drops of only 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, lasting just a couple of years. That's still significant. It would definitely stress human populations, but it's not apocalyptic. It's the kind of climate shock that resilient hunter-gatherer populations could potentially weather without massive die-offs. Other studies have looked at ice core data and lake sediment records from around 74,000 years ago. They're searching for evidence of the prolonged global cooling that should have followed Toba, and they're not finding it. Some records show brief cooling, but nothing like the decade-long volcanic winter some theories predicted. So if Toba wasn't the apocalyptic disaster we thought, where did the genetic bottleneck come from? Because remember, the genetic evidence is solid. Human genetic diversity really did crash around this time. We really do show signs of a severe population reduction, just maybe not from a volcano. Enter the alternative explanations, and there are several, each supported by different lines of evidence. The first possibility is disease. Modern humans were expanding their range around 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, moving into new territories, encountering new pathogens. Every time a population expands into previously uninhabited regions, they face disease risks. Novel viruses, bacteria, parasites that local fauna have adapted to but newcomers haven't. We've seen this pattern throughout history. European colonizers bringing smallpox to the Americas, the Black Death sweeping through medieval populations that had no immunity, HIV jumping from apes to humans and becoming pandemic. Ancient humans would have faced similar risks. A novel pathogen emerging in one population could have spread through the trading networks, connecting human groups across Africa and beyond. In small, isolated populations, a virulent disease could be devastating. Mortality rates of 50%, 60%, even higher in some groups. The thing about disease bottlenecks is they can be extremely severe but leave almost no archaeological trace. People don't die in ways that fossilize. Settlements might be abandoned, but the structures and tools remain. Years later, survivors or new migrants move in, and life continues, looking archaeologically continuous even though the population has been devastated. The genetic signature will be identical to what we see: severe reduction in population size followed by expansion and recovery. Disease is actually one of the most common causes of population bottlenecks in animal species. Why not humans? The second alternative is competition, not between humans and other species, but between different human groups. Remember, 100,000 years ago, Africa hosted multiple hominin species. Homo sapiens, yes, but also late surviving populations of Homo heidelbergensis, possibly others we haven't discovered yet. These groups would have been competing for the same resources, the same water sources, the same hunting territories, the same tool-making materials. And when resources become scarce, competition turns violent. There's increasing evidence that early human populations engaged in warfare and intergroup violence. Skeletal remains showing signs of violent death. Mass graves suggesting organized conflicts. The capacity for large-scale violence seems to be ancient, part of our species from very early on. A period of intense intergroup competition, possibly triggered by climate stress less dramatic than Toba, but still significant, could have reduced populations severely, especially if one group developed technological or organizational advantages that let them dominate rivals. The winners expand, the losers disappear, and the genetic record shows a bottleneck. The third possibility is the most challenging to test, but perhaps the most intriguing. What if there wasn't a single bottleneck at all? What if human populations went through a long, gradual decline over tens of thousands of years, punctuated by multiple smaller crises? The genetic evidence for the bottleneck has error bars. When scientists say it happened around 900,000 to 600,000 years ago in the older bottleneck, or 74,000 years ago in the Toba scenario, they're giving their best estimate. But those estimates have ranges of uncertainty, measured in thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. What if human populations were low for a very long time, gradually declining as Africa went through repeated climate oscillations? What if we faced not one catastrophe, but dozens, each one reducing populations a little more, each one selecting for survival traits, until finally populations stabilized at a new, much smaller size? This model would explain why the archaeological record doesn't show a single dramatic break. There wouldn't be one, just a gradual thinning out of sites, fewer and fewer humans leaving traces, until you reach the bottleneck minimum, then a gradual expansion again. Some geneticists actually favor this interpretation. They argue that the genetic data is consistent with either a single sharp bottleneck or a prolonged period of low population. We assume a single catastrophe because it makes for a better story. But evolution doesn't always work through sudden dramatic events. Sometimes it's just slow, grinding pressure over immense timescales. The truth is, we don't know for certain what caused the bottleneck. Toba might have been part of it. Disease might have played a role. Competition, gradual decline, or some combination of all these factors could be responsible. What we do know is that science is a process, not a destination. The Toba catastrophe theory was proposed based on the best evidence available at the time. As new evidence emerges, from archaeology, from climate science, from genetics, we refine our understanding. We question assumptions. We develop alternative explanations. That's not a weakness. That's how science works. The story we're telling isn't finished. It's still being written, still being discovered in archaeological digs across Africa and India, in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, in the DNA of living people around the world. But here's what hasn't changed. Regardless of what caused it, the bottleneck was real. Human populations crashed to levels that should have meant extinction. We came terrifyingly close to disappearing forever. And somehow, against odds that should have been impossible, we survived. Whether it was one catastrophe or many, whether it lasted a few years or 100,000, our ancestors endured. They adapted. They persevered. That part of the story, at least, is certain, and it's the part that matters most. Let's get real about what survival actually meant during those 117,000 years. You wake up in a cave on the southern coast of Africa. It's morning, maybe 890,000 years ago. The air is cooler than your species has known for generations. Outside, the landscape is harsh, stripped of the lush vegetation your grandparents' might have told stories about. But you're alive, and today, like every day, your only job is to make sure you're still alive tomorrow. Your group numbers about 25 people. 3 extended families bound together by blood and necessity. There's your immediate family, your partner, 3 children who survived past infancy, which makes you lucky, your brother's family, and your mother, who at maybe 40 years old is considered ancient. A living library of survival knowledge that nobody can afford to lose. You don't live in just one cave. Your group moves seasonally between 3 or 4 sites within a territory of maybe 20 square miles. Each location offers different resources at different times. One cave sits near a freshwater spring that never quite dries up, even in the worst droughts. Another overlooks a rocky coastline where the tide pools teem with shellfish. A third provides access to a river valley where wild tubers grow in the rainy season, if there is a rainy season that year. This mobility is what keeps you alive. Put 25 people in one spot permanently, and they'd exhaust the local resources within months. But keep moving in a carefully planned circuit. Let each location recover while you exploit the others, and you can make it work. Barely. Your morning starts with fire management. Keeping fire going is a full-time obsession. You don't have reliable methods to start fire on demand, not yet. So you maintain embers constantly, banking them at night in ash and dried dung, nurturing them back to flame each morning. Losing your fire means days or weeks of traveling to another group to beg for embers. It means cold nights, raw food, and vulnerability to predators. It means potential death, so you feed the fire carefully, efficiently. Every piece of wood is precious because the landscape is increasingly barren. You've learned to burn dried animal dung when wood is scarce. You've learned to use bone as fuel. Nothing is wasted. Then comes foraging. This isn't a casual walk through nature. This is systematic, learned, strategic exploitation of every calorie your territory offers. Your mother knows the location of every tuber patch within a day's walk. She knows which roots are edible and which will kill you. She knows where to find the grubs that live under the bark of dead trees, each one a precious packet of fat and protein. She knows the seasonal movements of small game, the nesting sites of ground birds, the locations of beehives. This knowledge isn't written down. It can't be. It exists only in the memories of the oldest members of your group, passed down through demonstration and repetition. Watch how grandmother digs for this root. See the way she tests the soil moisture with her fingers first. Notice how she marks the location so she can return next season without depleting the patch entirely. One mistake, one forgotten lesson, could mean starvation. The women and children do most of the gathering. Not because of some prehistoric gender roles exactly, but because it's efficient. Gathering requires intimate local knowledge, patience, the ability to process information about hundreds of different plant species. It also allows you to keep the children close, teaching them while they work. The calories you bring in are reliable, predictable, the foundation of your group's survival. The men typically focus on hunting, though everyone does everything when necessary. But hunting during the bottleneck isn't the dramatic big game stalking you might imagine. The vast herds that once roamed Africa are gone, died out or migrated to regions you can't reach. What's left are small animals, opportunistic targets. You're not apex predators, you're survivors. You hunt small antelope when you can corner them in ravines. You trap rock hyrax, rabbit-sized mammals that den in cliff faces. You steal kills from smaller predators when the opportunity arises, using your numbers and your fire-hardened spears to chase off wildcats or jackals. Sometimes you're successful, often you're not. The hunting provides crucial protein and fat, but it's irregular, feast or famine. But there's one resource that's changed everything for your particular group: the ocean. Your cave overlooks a rocky stretch of coastline where the cold Benguela current upwells, bringing nutrients that support an explosion of marine life. The tide pools here are reliable in a way terrestrial resources aren't. Twice a day the ocean delivers food to you: limpets clinging to rocks, mussels in dense beds, sea snails, occasionally octopus trapped in shallow pools at low tide, even seaweed, rich in iodine and other micronutrients. This is why your group has survived when others haven't. The coast provides a buffer against the worst of the inland droughts. When the terrestrial resources fail completely, when the tubers won't grow and the game disappears, you can always fall back on the tide pools. It's not glamorous food. Shellfish are small, time-consuming to gather, tedious to process. But they're there, reliable, constant. Archaeological sites along the South African coast from this period show massive shell middens, piles of discarded shells meters deep. Evidence that humans huddled along these coastlines for thousands of years, eating unglamorous seafood while waiting for the world inland to become livable again. Your ancestors were among them. The daily routine of shellfish gathering becomes almost meditative. You wade into tide pools at low tide, feeling with your feet for the distinctive shape of mussels. You pry limpets from rocks with a stone wedge, the same motion thousands of times until your fingers ache. Back at the cave, you roast them over the fire until the shells open. The meat inside is small, but it adds up. 100 shellfish. 200. Enough to fill bellies, keep children growing, maintain the strength needed to survive another day. But survival is about more than just calories. It's about maintaining the social bonds that keep your group functioning. 25 people living close quarters for 117,000 years. That's a pressure cooker for conflict. Arguments over food distribution, disagreements about when to move camp, tensions over mating, childcare, status within the group. Your people have developed mechanisms to manage this, elaborate food-sharing customs that ensure everyone gets fed, not equally necessarily, but predictably. The best hunters get larger portions, but they're also expected to share. Children and pregnant women get priority. The elderly, like your mother, earn their share through their knowledge, their teaching, their role as living repositories of survival information. You have rituals, too. Simple ones, but important. Gathering round the fire at night to share stories. Not grand epics yet, but accounts of the day's foraging. News from other groups encountered during seasonal movements. Warnings about dangerous animals or places where water was found. These fireside gatherings serve multiple purposes. They distribute vital survival information. They reinforce group bonds. They teach children the knowledge they'll need to survive. And there's art, or something like it. Ochre pigments ground and mixed with fat, used to decorate bodies during significant occasions. A successful hunt. A child's first gathering expedition. Perhaps funerary practices for the dead, though evidence is scarce. These aren't elaborate rituals, but they're the beginnings of symbolic thinking, the human impulse to mark meaningful moments, to create meaning in a world that seems determined to destroy you. The psychological burden of this existence is almost impossible for us to imagine. You watch children die regularly. Infant mortality is probably 50% or higher. Starvation, disease, accidents, predation. You lose siblings, cousins, friends. Some seasons are better than others, but bad seasons are brutally bad. Watching your child starve slowly because there simply isn't enough food. Making impossible choices about who gets the limited calories available, yet you persist. Something in the human spirit, some fundamental, stubborn refusal to give up, keeps you going. Maybe it's the fire, that tangible symbol that you can shape your environment, that you're not helpless. Maybe it's the knowledge your mother shares, proof that others have survived before, and so can you. Maybe it's simply the biological imperative, the deep genetic drive to survive and reproduce no matter what. Other groups are out there, you know. Occasionally you encounter them during seasonal movements, sometimes peacefully, trading information about water sources or food locations, possibly exchanging marriage partners, though the demographics of extinction make this complicated. With so few humans total, every group needs to maintain connections with others to avoid inbreeding. But encounters can also be tense. When resources are desperately scarce, neighboring groups become competitors, threats. There's archaeological evidence of violence from this period, skeletal remains showing healed fractures consistent with interpersonal conflict. Not war exactly, but certainly disputes that turned physical. Territories are defended, intrusions are resisted. Despite the hardship, despite the constant proximity to death, life has moments of something almost like normalcy. Children play in tide pools, learning to forage while chasing crabs. Adults laugh at shared jokes, take pleasure in a particularly successful gathering day. Couples bond over shared survival tasks. Your mother tells stories while showing your daughter which plants are safe. This is life on the brink, not heroic, not dramatic in the moment, just the grinding, relentless work of survival. Day after day, generation after generation, for 117,000 years. You don't know you're part of a genetic bottleneck. You don't know your descendants will inherit the earth. You just know that today you found enough shellfish to feed your family, that the fire is still burning, that everyone survived another night, and tomorrow you'll do it all again. Here's where the story gets strange, almost suspiciously well-timed. Remember, your ancestors were pushed to the absolute brink between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. 117,000 years of barely hanging on, scattered groups struggling just to see another sunrise. But somewhere in that desperate scramble for survival, something happened. Something that would change everything about what it means to be human. Because right around the time of the bottleneck, maybe during it, maybe just after, human cognition took a leap that scientists still struggle to fully explain. We call it the cognitive revolution, or the emergence of behavioral modernity, which is academic speak for the time when humans started thinking like us instead of like clever apes. The timing isn't exact. Archaeological dating from this far back has margins of error measured in tens of thousands of years. But the correlation is striking enough that researchers can't ignore it. The bottleneck happens, human populations crash. Survival becomes a daily knife-edge calculation. And right around then, or maybe shortly after, humans start doing things they'd never done before. Things that require abstract thinking, symbolic reasoning, planning multiple steps into the future. Coincidence? Maybe. But there's another possibility, one that's both darker and more hopeful. What if the crisis created us? What if those 117,000 years of barely surviving didn't just select for humans who could endure, but for humans who could innovate, who could think in entirely new ways? The evidence starts showing up in caves, which makes sense because caves are where desperate people go when the world outside becomes unlivable. And caves, thankfully for us, preserve things. Tools, bones, pigments, the residue of human presence that would wash away or decay anywhere else. One of the most important discoveries comes from Blombus Cave on the southern coast of South Africa. It's not much to look at from outside, just another limestone cave overlooking the ocean. But inside, archaeologists found something extraordinary. Evidence of human creativity dating back between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, right in the window when the bottleneck was either ending or recently concluded. They found pieces of ochre, a red iron oxide pigment, etched with geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines forming deliberate designs. This isn't accidental scratching or random marks. These are patterns, repeated and intentional. Someone sat in that cave and carved symbols into pieces of rock for reasons that had nothing to do with immediate survival. Think about what that means. Your ancestor, living in a world where every day might be their last, where finding enough food and water occupied most of their waking thoughts, took time to create something purely symbolic. Not a tool, not something to help them eat or stay warm. Art, abstract representation, the external manifestation of internal thought. They also found shell beads, tiny marine snail shells, carefully pierced and apparently strung together as jewelry or decoration. Again, this serves no survival purpose. A necklace doesn't help you hunt or gather or fight off predators. But it does something else. It signals, it identifies. It says, I belong to this group, or I have this status, or I value beauty enough to spend time creating it. The bone tools found at Blombos show similar sophistication. Not just bones broken and used as improvised implements, but carefully shaped awls and points designed for specific tasks. Someone was planning ahead, thinking, I need to pierce leather to make clothing, so I'll create a tool specifically for that purpose. Other sites from roughly the same period show similar innovations scattered across Africa. Stone blades created using heat treatment, where rocks were deliberately placed in fires to change their fracture properties before being shaped into tools. This requires understanding abstract principles of physics, the ability to delay gratification. You have to heat the stone and wait for it to cool before you can use it, and multi-step planning. But here's what makes all this so remarkable. None of these innovations was strictly necessary for survival. Humans had survived for millions of years without art, without jewelry, without heat-treated stone tools. Our ancestors during the bottleneck could have kept doing what earlier humans had always done, scavenging, hunting with simple tools, using basic fire, and they would have survived just fine. Instead, they started creating, started innovating, started making things that existed purely in the realm of symbolic thought and abstract reasoning. So what changed? Why did humans emerging from the bottleneck suddenly start behaving so differently from humans who came before? One theory suggests the bottleneck created a perfect storm of selective pressures that favored cognitive innovation. When resources are abundant and populations are stable, there's no particular advantage to being unusually creative or innovative. The old ways work fine. Why risk trying something new? But when you're one disaster away from extinction, when the old strategies aren't sufficient anymore, suddenly innovation becomes survival. The individuals who could think of new solutions, new approaches, new ways to exploit marginal resources, they were the ones who lived long enough to have children. Over 117,000 years, that's thousands of generations, this selection pressure would be intense. Every generation, the individuals who are slightly more creative, slightly better at abstract reasoning, slightly more capable of innovation would have better survival odds. Gradually, relentlessly, the bottleneck would select for increased cognitive capacity. But there's more to it than just individual intelligence. The bottleneck would also select for social innovations, new ways of organizing groups and sharing information. Because in a crisis, cooperation beats individual brilliance every time. Language probably played a crucial role. Now, we know humans had some form of communication long before the bottleneck. Even chimpanzees can communicate basic information. But complex language, the ability to convey abstract concepts, talk about things that aren't immediately present, teach complicated skills to others, that's different. That requires sophisticated cognitive machinery. The bottleneck would have made language incredibly valuable. Small scattered groups trying to maintain connections across vast distances need good communication. Parents trying to teach survival skills to children who might face completely different challenges need to convey abstract principles, not just specific behaviors. Groups trying to coordinate hunts or share information about resources need precise, detailed language. Every improvement in language ability would provide massive advantages. And unlike physical traits that take countless generations to evolve, language is partly cultural. One innovative individual develops a new way to express complex ideas, and everyone who learns from them benefits immediately. The innovation spreads through the population in one generation, not 1,000. This creates a feedback loop. Better language allows more effective teaching. More effective teaching allows the accumulation of more complex knowledge. More complex knowledge creates pressure for even better language. Round and round, each generation building on the innovations of the last. The archaeological evidence supports this. The standardized tool designs appearing after the bottleneck suggest detailed verbal instructions being passed between groups. You can't create identical tools across hundreds of miles unless people are communicating precise technical information. Strike the stone at this angle with this force can't be conveyed through grunting and pointing. The symbolic artifacts, the ochre engravings and shell beads, suggest something even more sophisticated. These require shared symbolic systems. Everyone in your group has to agree that these marks mean something, that these beads signify something. That's culture. That's abstract reasoning expressed through material objects. Some researchers think the crisis might have even changed human social structures in ways that promoted innovation. Small groups under extreme stress can't afford rigid hierarchies or authoritarian leadership. When conditions change unpredictably, you need every member of the group capable of making decisions, adapting, innovating. The groups that survived might have been the ones that developed more egalitarian structures, where knowledge was shared widely and new ideas were valued regardless of who thought of them. This would explain why behavioral modernity appears relatively suddenly in the archaeological record. It's not that humans suddenly got smarter on an individual level. It's that they developed social and cultural systems that allowed innovation to flourish and spread rapidly. Of course, not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Some researchers think the cognitive revolution had nothing to do with a bottleneck. They point out that the timing isn't perfect. Some evidence of symbolic behavior appears before the bottleneck. Other evidence appears much later. Maybe the correlation is just coincidence. Others argue that behavioral modernity developed gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, and we only see it suddenly appearing in the archaeological record because older sites haven't preserved the evidence. Maybe early humans were just as cognitively sophisticated as their descendants, but they expressed it in ways that didn't leave lasting traces. Fair points, both of them. We're talking about events nearly 1 million years ago. The evidence is fragmentary, the dating is uncertain, and we're trying to infer complex cognitive processes from a few stone tools and pieces of carved ochre. But here's what we do know. Something changed around the time of the bottleneck. Humans coming out of that crisis were different from humans going in. They had new tools, new social structures, new ways of thinking about and interacting with the world. Maybe the bottleneck caused it. Maybe it just happened to coincide with changes that would have occurred anyway. But there's something compelling about the idea that our ancestors' greatest crisis created our species' greatest strengths, that the same forces that nearly destroyed humanity also forged the cognitive tools we would eventually use to dominate the planet. Because those tools, abstract thinking, symbolic reasoning, complex language, innovative problem solving, those are what separate us from every other species on Earth. Those are what allowed a small population of African survivors to eventually spread across every continent, adapt to every environment, and build civilizations that would have seemed like magic to our bottleneck ancestors. We are the descendants of survivors, but maybe more importantly, we're the descendants of innovators, people who faced impossible odds and responded not just by enduring, but by creating entirely new ways of being human. The first thing you would have noticed is the silence beginning to lift. For generations, the soundtrack of the world had been scarcity, empty valleys, dry riverbeds, winds blowing over places where nothing moved but dust. Your ancestors had learned to read that silence like a warning. No grass meant no antelope, no birdsong meant no water meant people died. But then, very slowly, almost too slowly for any single person to notice, the pattern began to shift. Rains that used to fail 3 years out of 4 started coming every other year, then most years. Tiny trickles in old stream beds grew into seasonal creeks. Patches of tough, scrubby grass spread into thin, wavering sheets of green. Insects returned, then small animals, then larger herds, cautious at first, then bolder as the seasons stabilized. If you had been a child in one of those bands, one of maybe 20, 30 people, you would not have known you were living at the turning point of your species. All you would have seen was that the elders didn't look quite as worried every time the clouds gathered, that there was meat a little more often, that desperate arguments over a single carcass became less frequent, that sometimes there was enough to share. This is what recovery looks like in deep time, not a sudden miracle, not a clean break between catastrophe and abundance, just a long, slow easing of the strangling hand around humanity's throat. Over thousands of years, those tiny improvements added up. A slightly better survival rate for children here, a few fewer deaths from starvation there, a woman who lived long enough to have one more child than her mother, a man who survived one more bad season than his grandfather. Small numbers, but stretched across hundreds of generations, they became an avalanche. Population geneticists reading our DNA today see the shadow of that shift. For a very long time after the bottleneck, the genetic signal says tiny, isolated, barely hanging on. Then, roughly between 60,000 and 50,000 years ago, the picture changes. The effective population size, that genetic stand-in for how many breeding adults there were, starts climbing. Not explosively at first, just steadily, like a campfire being coaxed from glowing coals into visible flame. Your ancestors were still few by modern standards, maybe tens of thousands across the whole of Africa. Scattered, cautious, always one bad decade away from disaster. But compared to the mere thousands who had once carried all of human possibility, this was a recovery boom. As the world softened, those small bands began to stretch their legs. The old refugees of the places that had sheltered them through the worst of the climate crisis were becoming crowded, at least by hunter-gatherer standards. When you live entirely off wild plants and animals, you cannot tolerate dense populations, too many people in one place, and you strip the land bare. So when the land improved, there was an obvious solution. You move, not as armies, not as mass migrations in neat lines across a map. More like a slow breathing, groups fanning out along rivers that had started to run again, families following herds into new grazing territories, explorers, curious hunters, bold teenagers, restless elders, walking over one more ridge then another, until they found a valley no one remembered living in. They would leave behind hearths grown familiar, trees carved with old markings, the graves of their dead. They would carry with them memories, stories, and the few pieces of physical wealth they owned. Stone tools, fire-starting kits, baskets, beads, maybe a favorite spear point worn smooth from years of use. Each new camp they built was a small wager placed against the future. Maybe the rains will be good air. Maybe the animals will return. Maybe this will be a safe place to raise children. Some of those bets failed. Bones left in caves tell the stories of groups that starved, of settlements abandoned in a hurry, but others succeeded. And when they did, the reward was room to grow. Genetically, we can see evidence of this restless spreading in the way diversity begins to reaccumulate. After the bottleneck, humans were astonishingly similar at the DNA level. Too similar. Our ancestors have been squeezed so hard that many lineages simply vanished. But as populations recovered and expanded into different environments, new variations began to appear. Mutations popped up and stuck around if they helped people deal with local conditions. New foods, new climates, new diseases. By 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, the genetic record shows branching. Lineages splitting, drifting apart, sometimes meeting again, only to split once more. This is what you'd expect from small groups moving, settling, scattering, reconnecting across a whole continent. And as bodies and genes adapted, so did cultures. Toolkits that had once been fairly simple during the harshest times became more varied and specialized. Where earlier humans might have relied on a few multi-purpose implements, an all-purpose hand axe here, a generic scraper there, the recovering populations began to experiment. In some regions of Africa, archaeologists see the rise of tiny, carefully shaped stone blades called microliths. On their own, they look unimpressive, little shards of stone you could lose between your fingers. But they were designed to be combined, inset into wooden or bone shafts to make composite tools, serrated knives, barbed arrows, or multi-pointed spears. Elsewhere, people developed elegant leaf-shaped spear points. Some communities favored long, slender blades ideal for butchering animals efficiently. Others crafted heavy-duty scrapers for processing hides into clothing, bags, or shelters. You can think of this period as the diversification of human problem-solving. Different landscapes demanded different solutions. Forest edge, open savanna, riverine wetlands, rocky highlands, each produced its own accent in stone. And yet, when you line up tools from sites separated by hundreds of miles, you start to see patterns, shared shapes, familiar techniques, echoes of the same idea. This is the archaeological fingerprint of something your ancestors were becoming very good at: sharing. Imagine two bands meeting after months or years apart. Maybe they follow the same herd's seasonal migrations. Maybe they both use the same distant obsidian source, a glittering volcanic glass that makes superb blades. They meet near a waterhole. There is caution at first, weapons kept close, children pulled behind adults. Then, recognition, a familiar style of beadwork, a stone point shaped in a way that your people also use, a song half remembered from another gathering long ago. Tension dissolves into trade. You give them a beautifully prepared spear point. In return, you receive a string of shells carried from a distant coastline you've never seen. You show them a nutting technique to strengthen their snares. They show you how they smoke fish so it keeps longer on the trail. An elder tells a story about a year when the rains failed and how her people survived by eating a particular root. Someone else shares a warning about a valley where drinking from a certain spring always seems to make people sick. Knowledge moves from group to group like pollen carried on a shifting wind. Over time, this web of exchange thickens. Genetic evidence supports this picture. Instead of fully isolated inbred groups, we see signs of structured mating patterns, individuals traveling between communities, partners exchanged along kinship lines, genes moving much farther than any single person ever walked in their lifetime. Trade routes weren't just for stone and shells, They were for people, too, and as groups ranged farther and curiosity tugged at human feet, one particular kind of landscape began drawing more and more attention: the coast. From space, shorelines looked like edges, but to hungry, observant humans they were highways, narrow belts rich in resources stretching for hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers. Along the African coasts, especially the eastern and southern shores, your ancestors found something extraordinary: relative stability. While inland climates could swing wildly between wet and dry, coastlines often buffered those extremes. Upwelling currents brought nutrient-rich waters close to shore, shellfish, fish, seabirds, seals, all potential food sources far less affected by inland droughts. Archaeological sites perched on ancient dunes and rocky headlands preserve this change in strategy. Piles of shells, oyster, mussel, limpets, build up into mounds known as middens, some stretching meters deep. Mixed into them, charcoal from repeated fires, bone fragments from fish and marine mammals, and the tools used to harvest and process them. These coastal foragers weren't just grabbing whatever washed up on the beach. They seemed to have developed systematic ways of exploiting the shore, timing visits with tides, knowing when certain shellfish were safest to eat, learning where seasonal fish runs would bring schools close enough to trap or spear. Living at the edge of land and sea may also have done something else important. It trained human minds to think in terms of routes. Walk along almost any coastline, and you have a built-in guide. Keep the ocean on your left or on your right, and you can follow it for days, weeks, months. You don't have to navigate by landmarks alone. The shore itself is the landmark. Many researchers think this is how some of the earliest long-distance expansions began. Small groups moving step by step along beaches, estuaries, mangroves, never too far from fresh water or food. No heroic leaps across empty maps, just generation after generation pushing a little farther than the last. This coastal migration idea remains debated in its details, but it fits what we know about humans from this time: opportunistic, curious, highly observant, reluctant to leave rich environments, but ready to move if the next bay overlooks just a bit better. Along the Indian Ocean rim, from eastern Africa toward the Arabian Peninsula and beyond, shorelines would have offered a kind of living conveyor belt. Every few days' walk, another cove, another river mouth, another chance to settle or move on. People could have spread surprisingly far without ever feeling like they were making a grand journey, just following the food. As they moved, technology and culture moved with them. You can imagine a camp at dusk on some long-vanished shore 55,000 years ago. The air smells of salt and smoke. Children crack shells against stones, prying out the last bits of meat. Adults sit in a loose ring around a fire, hands busy. Some are retouching blades, turning broken points into new tools. Others are threading shells, tiny, carefully pierced beads, onto plant fibers, assembling necklaces or belts. Someone tells a story, words flowing in a language no one will ever hear again, but whose descendants we still carry on our tongues. The story might be about a time of terrible hunger, when the game disappeared and rivers dried, how the ancestors fled to a far coast and learned the ways of the waves, how they survived when others did not, how certain rituals or taboos were born in those hard days. As the storyteller speaks, listeners don't just hear entertainment, they hear instructions for living, warnings, strategies, identity. Under the soft murmur of their voices lies an unbroken thread stretching back to the bottleneck. Remember what nearly destroyed us. Remember how we survived. Pass it on. And so, as populations climbed and landscapes filled, humanity didn't simply multiply in numbers. It multiplied in ways of being. Different bands developed distinct decorative styles, bead patterns, body paint, carved designs on bone and wood. Some groups favored elaborate personal adornment, layering shells, teeth, and pigments. Others invested more heavily in hunting gear or in fine, delicate tools for processing plants. Rituals diverged. Some buried their dead with goods, others did not. Some carved abstract symbols on stones and cave walls, hints of the symbolic explosion that would later become full-blown art. From a distance of tens of thousands of years, it might be tempting to smooth all of this into a single phrase: the human recovery. But up close, it wasn't a single story. It was millions of local stories braided together. Camps that succeeded and camps that failed. Inventions born in one small valley that slowly diffused across half a continent. Genetic lineages that flickered out in a single bad winter, and others that threaded their way, against all odds, into the modern world. Every time a group left behind a handprint on a rock, a cache of tools, a discarded necklace, they were leaving a message for the future, even if they didn't know it. We were here. We adapted. We endured. By the time the population began surging more dramatically, by the time we see that strong genetic signal of growth between 60,000 and 50,000 years ago, the groundwork had been laid over countless quiet generations. The meta-population web had thickened into something resilient. Knowledge flowed between communities, trade routes stitched together inland and coast, river valley and highland, forest edge and open plain. Humanity wasn't out of danger. It never really is. But the era when a single drought could erase the entire species had passed. The slow climb back from the brink was nearly complete. And at the edges of Africa, along river mouths, across narrow straits, on beaches facing distant lands, some of your ancestors were already looking across the water, wondering what lay beyond the far horizon. Soon, a few of them would decide to find out. Picture that shoreline. It's just before dawn, somewhere along the northeastern edge of Africa, around 60,000 years ago. The air is cool, the sea is calm, and the stars are fading one by one into the slow brightening of the sky. On a low ridge above the water, a small band of humans is waking up. They look like you. If you could walk among them, you wouldn't see monsters or missing links. You'd see people. Parents stretching stiff muscles after a night on the ground. Children rubbing sleep from their eyes. Hunters checking spear points. Traders fingering beads and shells strung on cords of animal sinew. They speak a language you would never understand, but the rhythms of it would feel strangely familiar. Jokes, arguments, instructions, comforting murmurs to a crying child. And somewhere, near the edge of the camp, a few of them are looking east, across a narrow band of water, toward a land they've never seen but have heard about in stories, a land called something you and I will never know, a place across the sea. The narrow crossing between them and that unknown world is what we now call the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. It's only a few dozen kilometers wide at its narrowest point. During ice ages, when sea levels dropped, it would have been even narrower, broken by islands and shoals. On a clear day, you could probably see the faint shadow of land on the horizon. For generations, their ancestors had moved along this coast, following fish-rich shallows, gathering shellfish, exploiting mangroves and estuaries. The sea was not a barrier. It was a highway. Now, some of them are about to cross it. They don't know they're leaving Africa. They don't know they're about to start the greatest expansion in the history of their species. They just know there's land over there, and that sometimes, when game is scarce and neighbors are too close, the difference between survival and extinction is whether anyone in your band is willing to take a risk. This is the moment when Out of Africa stopped being a slow drift within a continent and became a global conquest. But the strait wasn't the only path. If you pull back and look at a map, 3 main doors lead out of Africa. The first is the Nile Corridor, a long green ribbon running north from Central and Eastern Africa, through deserts that would kill a careless traveler in days, all the way to the Mediterranean coast. For much of prehistory, the Nile was a lifeline, a predictable route threaded with water, plants, animals, and other humans. Some groups likely followed this river north, pushed by drought in their homelands or pulled by rumors of rich deltas and new hunting grounds. The second door is the Sinai Peninsula, a bridge of land between Africa and the Middle East, squeezed between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. During wetter phases, this area would have been dotted with lakes, wetlands, and grasslands, stepping stones of habitat that humans could hop between. Fossils and stone tools found in what is now Israel, Jordan, and Syria suggest that humans moved through this gate multiple times, long before the final successful wave 60,000 years ago. The third door is that narrow sea crossing at Bab el-Mandeb, a short leap from the Horn of Africa to the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Genetic evidence hints that this southern coastal route may have been especially important. Once humans reached Arabia, they could skim along the coasts of the Indian Ocean, like surfers following a perfect wave, down through Yemen and Oman, across southern Iran and Pakistan, into India, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Different groups likely used different doors at different times. Some expeditions probably failed. Droughts closed corridors. Sea levels rose. Rival groups blocked passages. But enough crossings succeeded that, over thousands of years, Africa stopped being the entire human world and became just the starting line. Beyond those doors, though, there was a surprise waiting. Because Earth, at that time, was not an empty stage. When your ancestors stepped into the Levant, or hugged the coasts of Arabia, or pushed into the cold plains of Eurasia, they weren't pioneers arriving in untouched wilderness. They were walking into neighborhoods that were already occupied by cousins. Neanderthals had made Europe and parts of Western Asia their home for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans, those shadowy relatives we know mostly from DNA and a few bones, seem to have dominated parts of Asia. There may have been other archaic humans too, lingering populations of Homo heidelbergensis, or descendants of even older lineages, occupying pockets of favorable terrain. Imagine being one of those first modern humans cresting a rocky ridge somewhere in the Middle East, and seeing other people on the far slope. Their faces, familiar but strange, heavy brows, broader noses, more muscular bodies. The way they carry their tools and move across the landscape is practiced, confident. This is their home turf. What happens next, we don't know exactly. But the genetic record scattered through our chromosomes like footnotes from the past suggests that the encounters were not simple. They weren't one-sided massacres. They weren't peaceful utopias either. Sometimes groups probably avoided each other, steering clear of rival hunters the way wolves and lions avoid costly fights over carcasses. Sometimes there may have been territorial skirmishes, sudden ambushes at waterholes, or long cold standoffs at the mouths of valleys rich in game. And sometimes, clearly, there was something else. Because when geneticists look at the genomes of people living today outside of Africa, they see traces of Neanderthal DNA woven into every one of them. 1.5% to 2% on average in Europeans, Asians, Native Americans. As if every person outside Africa is carrying a small, quiet inheritance from Neanderthal ancestors they never knew they had. In some parts of Asia and Oceania, they find another thread, Denisovan DNA. In certain populations in Melanesia, Aboriginal Australians, and some groups in Southeast Asia, as much as 5% of the genome can be traced to Denisovan sources, like faint echoes from ancient meetings in some forgotten valley or on a remote island shore. These numbers may sound small, 2% here, 5% there. But think of what they mean. They mean that at least some of those encounters ended not with spears in the dark, but with shared shelters and shared beds. They mean that modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans weren't completely separate kinds of beings, but branches of the same family tree close enough to knit back together when life brought them into contact. They mean that some child, half Neanderthal, half modern human, grew up in a mixed band, learned to nap stone or track animals, and lived long enough to have children of their own, long enough for their genes to fold into the growing tapestry of the expanding human population. In some cases, those genes made a difference. Neanderthal variants in modern humans have been linked, tentatively and not always conclusively, to things like immune responses, skin and hair traits, even sensitivity to sunlight. Denisovan variants helped some populations adapt to high altitudes, processing low oxygen air on the Tibetan Plateau. Other archaic genes may have influenced how we respond to pathogens, how we store fat, how our bodies handle cold or scarce food. The expansion out of Africa wasn't just a migration. It was a blending, a remixing of survival strategies honed by different human species in different environments, now poured together into one rapidly spreading lineage. As this blended lineage moved east, its speed becomes almost unbelievable. From the first successful expansions out of Africa around 60 to 70,000 years ago, it may have taken only 10 to 20,000 years for modern humans to reach Australia. In evolutionary terms, that's almost instantaneous, a geological heartbeat. Following that southern coastal route, groups would have moved along the shores of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, exploiting rich marine ecosystems, fish, shellfish, seabirds, mangrove fruits. They were all predictable, renewable food sources, and humans were getting better and better at using them. By the time they reached Southeast Asia, these coastal travelers were already skilled at crossing rivers, estuaries, maybe short sea gaps. The Indonesian archipelago, even at lower sea levels, was never a single block of land. There were always channels of water between islands. But sometime between about 65,000 and 50,000 years ago, humans made a series of crossings that took them beyond the continental shelf to Sal, the ancient landmass that combined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. Those crossings required boats, or at least rafts or watercraft sophisticated enough to carry families, tools, and food across stretches of open sea where land was not always visible. No one knows exactly what those vessels looked like. No paintings remain. No wooden hulls have survived. But the presence of humans in Australia by 65,000 to 50,000 years ago is very hard to explain without them. On that continent, they encountered ecosystems that had never seen humans before. Giant marsupials, enormous reptiles, huge flightless birds. Within a relatively short time, many of those megafauna species vanished, whether through direct hunting, habitat changes caused by fire and landscape management, or climate fluctuations amplified by human presence. The arrival of people reshaped those environments forever, from Africa to Arabia, from Arabia to India, from India to Southeast Asia, from Southeast Asia to Australia. All of that probably within the lifespan of a few thousand generations. Meanwhile, other branches of that same expanding population pushed north, up through the Levant and into the heartlands of the Neanderthals, across the cold steppes of Central Asia, eventually over land bridges and Ice Age corridors into the Americas, much later in the story. By then, the world was no longer a patchwork of separate human species. It was becoming something else, a single, hugely variable, deeply interconnected human superpopulation, with local flavors but shared ancestry. And if you trace that ancestry back, past all the mixing with Neanderthals in Europe, past all the blending with Denisovans in Asia, past the splits inside Africa that gave rise to different lineages there, you arrive in a very small room. A population of maybe 2,000 breeding individuals 900,000 years ago, clinging to survival during the Great Crisis. Think about the numbers. From a bottlenecked population barely larger than a modern village, the human lineage rode out 117,000 years of climate chaos. Then, as conditions improved, it expanded within Africa, split into multiple human species, recombined through interbreeding, and eventually sent one particularly adaptable branch out to the continent. That branch, your branch, met its cousins, traded genes and technologies, and kept moving. Along river valleys and coastlines, across deserts and mountains, over frozen land bridges and narrow seas, those few thousand survivors became, step by step, wave by wave, connection by connection, the ancestors of 8 billion people alive today. Every person you pass on the street, every face in every crowd, every voice carried on every city wind, all of them are part of the same improbable chain, a chain that runs through that tiny bottlenecked population, through Neanderthal valleys and Denisovan mountainsides, through coastal camps on the shores of the Indian Ocean, through campsites on ancient Australian rivers that now run dry. In your own DNA, you carry whispers of this entire journey, African roots that reach back nearly 1 million years, Neanderthal fragments that remember cold European winters, Denisovan segments that once helped someone's ancestors breathe in thin Himalayan air or thrive on strange new plants. A genetic patchwork sewn together by migrations, meetings, and choices made around ancient campfires. Out of Africa wasn't just a geographic expansion. It was the moment when all these threads started to weave into a global tapestry. When a species forged in crisis began to fill every continent, testing the limits of its adaptability. The world would never be the same again, and neither would we. So what does any of this have to do with you, lying in bed, listening to a story about people who lived almost 1 million years ago? More than you might think. Because that ancient crisis, that near-extinction moment, didn't just shape our ancestors out there on the savannah. It shaped you, right now, down to the smallest details of your biology. Every cell in your body is a museum exhibit from that time. Your immune system, your brain chemistry, even the way you respond to stress. They all carry echoes of the bottleneck. One of the strangest consequences of almost going extinct is something geneticists call low genetic diversity. Compared to other mammals, humans are weirdly similar to each other at the DNA level. Take 2 chimpanzees from opposite sides of Africa. Their DNA will usually be more different from each other than yours is from someone living on the other side of the planet. In genetic terms, all 8 billion of us are like one very large, very extended family. That's the fingerprint of the bottleneck. When a population shrinks to just a tiny number of survivors, almost all the rare gene variants get lost. It's like shuffling a deck of cards and then burning half the suits. When the population finally grows again, it's rebuilding from whatever cards were left in that tiny deck. The result? Most humans today share a surprisingly similar genetic toolkit. But that similarity is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, low diversity can make us vulnerable. If a new disease appears that happens to exploit a common weakness in our immune systems, it can sweep through the whole species much more easily. There just isn't as much built-in variation for natural selection to work with. You can see faint hints of this in the way pandemics behave. A virus like influenza or COVID-19 can spread incredibly fast through human populations because we're biologically similar enough that the same strategies work on most of us. There are differences, of course. Some people get very sick, others barely notice. But for a global species, our range of responses is still quite narrow. Low diversity also means that certain genetic disorders can become widespread, simply because the few survivors of an ancient crisis happen to carry them. They weren't selected because they were good or bad. They were just there, in the right people at the right time. And when those people became the ancestors of everyone, their quirks went global. This is where another idea from population genetics comes in, the founder effect. Imagine a small group breaks off from a larger population and starts a new community somewhere far away. Maybe they cross a strip of land, an ice bridge, a narrow sea. They carry with them only a tiny slice of the genetic variation from their home population. Whatever traits happen to be common in that little group, even by chance, can become common in all their descendants. You can see founder effects today in much smaller stories that echo the big one. Some isolated communities, like the Amish in North America or certain island populations, have unusually high rates of specific genetic diseases. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because one or two of the original founders carried a rare mutation. When they had children, and their children had children, that rare gene quietly spread through a growing web of descendants. Over centuries, what was once a 1 in a million mutation can become common in a town, or a valley, or an island. Now take that idea and scale it up to the entire species. The ancient bottleneck acted like the ultimate founder event. Instead of a village founded by a few families, you had the future of humanity founded by maybe 1,280 breeding individuals. Every quirk in their DNA had a chance to spread across the entire planet. Some of these quirks were life-saving, variants that helped handle stress, resist infection, or think just a little more clearly under pressure. Others were neutral or even harmful, but they slipped through because natural selection is never perfect, especially in tiny scattered groups. Genetic drift, random chance, plays a huge role when populations are that small. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these chance events carved deep patterns into our DNA. Today, population geneticists can read those patterns like a travel diary written in molecules. They look at how similar or different people's genomes are in different regions and reconstruct ancient journeys. They can see where groups split, where they met again, where they interbred. They can tell with surprising precision when a population passed through its own smaller bottleneck, when it expanded, when it migrated, the migrations out of Africa, the spread into Europe and Asia, the crossing into the Americas, the peopling of tiny Pacific islands. All of it has left a faint but readable trace in our genes. In a sense, your DNA contains a map of your ancestors' footsteps, not just from one country to another, or one continent to another, but through crises and recoveries, through plagues and famines, through ice ages and warm periods and everything in between. But our reduced genetic diversity isn't just interesting for history. It has very real medical implications right now. Because our global gene pool is relatively shallow, certain inherited diseases show up again and again in unrelated populations. Sickle cell disease, for instance, is tied to a gene variant that once provided protection against malaria. In regions where malaria was deadly, that variant helped its carriers survive childhood, so it spread. But when a child inherits 2 copies of it, the result is a serious blood disorder. This kind of trade-off, where a gene is helpful in one context and harmful in another, is common in human biology. In a world on the brink, almost any adaptation that kept you alive long enough to reproduce could be favored, even if it caused problems later in life. Our ancient environment selected for survival now, not comfort at age 60. You can see echoes of this all over modern medicine. Genes that once improved fat storage or sugar handling, in a world of feast and famine, may now contribute to obesity and diabetes in a world of supermarkets and late-night snacks. Variants that helped manage intense stress in a dangerous environment may now show up as anxiety or mood disorders in safer, but more psychologically complex societies. The bottleneck didn't create these traits by itself, but it amplified them. It reduced the number of alternative solutions that natural selection could choose from. In a larger, more diverse population, there might have been multiple genetic ways to handle the same problem. But when you pass through a tiny genetic doorway, some of those options simply never make it through. At the same time, the very uniformity that can cause trouble, also gives medicine powerful tools. Because humans are so genetically similar, doctors and researchers can often identify disease-related genes more easily. Patterns stand out in our DNA, like repeated notes in a simple song. When a rare mutation causes a serious illness, researchers can compare the genomes of affected and unaffected individuals across the world and see what's different. In other species with huge diversity, that kind of analysis can be far more difficult. Our shared genetic background also means that a treatment developed in one part of the world can often help people thousands of miles away. A vaccine designed in one country can protect billions. A drug tested in a particular population can, with care and adjustment, be extended to many others. The same bottleneck that made us vulnerable to global pandemics also makes us uniquely suited to global medicine. Underneath all the complexity, diseases, adaptations, trade-offs, there's a quieter, more philosophical legacy of the bottleneck, our similarity. When you strip away language, culture, religion, and nationality, the genetic difference between any two people on Earth is tiny. On average, you and a stranger on the other side of the planet are more genetically alike than two chimpanzees living in the same forest. Our skin colors, facial features, hair types, these are surface patterns written on top of a deep, shared foundation. Variations adapted to sunlight, temperature, diet, altitude. Small tweaks layered over the same ancient blueprint. In a strange way, that near-extinction event long ago erased many of the deeper divisions that might have existed between early human groups. It forced our lineage through one narrow channel, so that all of us alive today are branches of the same relatively recent trunk. When geneticists talk about the most recent common ancestor of all living humans, they're not speaking metaphorically. There really was a person, or rather many overlapping people in a certain time window, whose descendants spread until they included everyone. Because of the bottleneck, that common ancestry isn't buried millions of years in the past. It's much more recent, within the last few 100,000 years, possibly much less. You carry that unity inside you. Every time you look at another person and see difference, your DNA is quietly whispering the opposite story. This is your cousin, many times removed. This is another survivor of the same ancient crisis. Another bearer of the same fused chromosome, the same narrow escape. Understanding that story doesn't just satisfy curiosity. It has practical consequences for our future. We now know, with stark clarity, that our species has already come close to vanishing at least once, maybe more than once. We survived, but not because we were invincible. We survived because a small number of scattered groups, in just the right places, with just the right combinations of traits, managed to hold on long enough for the world to change. Today, we face a different set of existential risks. Climate change, nuclear weapons, engineered pandemics, runaway technologies. The details have changed, but the underlying problem is the same. A single species, vulnerable to global shocks, living on one fragile planet. Population genetics gives us a harsh reminder. Low genetic diversity means we can't count on evolution to quickly rescue us if we trigger a global catastrophe. In a few fish species with enormous population sizes and high diversity, rapid adaptation is sometimes possible over short timescales. In humans, that kind of rapid genetic rescue is far less likely. We don't have millions of radically different gene combinations waiting in the wings, ready to step in if things go wrong. We have one species, one narrow range of biological solutions, spread thinly over a warming, changing world. But there is a silver lining. The same traits that got us through the bottleneck, cooperation, communication, the ability to share knowledge across vast distances, are exactly the tools we need now. Our ancestors didn't survive because they were stronger than everything else. They survived because they built networks, traded information, formed alliances, and passed down hard-won lessons. You are the heir to that strategy. When scientists model climate futures, when doctors track the spread of new viruses, when communities coordinate disaster response or rebuild after storms and fires, they're tapping into the same ancient capabilities that once kept tiny bands of humans alive in scattered African refuges. The story hidden in your genes is not just one of fragility. It's also one of resilience, of a species that almost disappeared and then slowly, carefully, learned how to navigate a dangerous planet. Lying here now, you're part of that story's latest chapter. Your heartbeat, your breath, your thoughts drifting between waking and sleep. All of them depend on a chain of survival decisions made by people who never knew your name, who never saw a city, who never imagined a world with billions of humans in it. They didn't leave you a manual. They left you something better. A body and brain honed by crisis, wired for cooperation, haunted by fear but capable of hope, and a shared genetic legacy that ties you to every other person on Earth. The bottleneck is over, but its shadow stretches into the present and into whatever future we choose to build. And that future, as our ancestors are about to discover in our story, will be shaped by one last great journey out of the land that had sheltered them and into the wider world. So what does all of this actually mean for you, lying there in the dark, listening to a story that began almost 1,000,000 years ago with a terrified group of primates clinging to life? It means this: you are the ending of a book that should have been burned 1,000 times over, and somehow never was. Those 1,280 survivors, or whatever the real number was, were never supposed to make it. Not in the sense that the odds were in their favor. The climate was against them. The geography was against them. Predators, diseases, starvation, random bad luck, all against them. For 117,000 years, everything about the environment screamed, "You do not belong here. You're not going to last." And they did anyway. That's the first lesson from the brink. Humans are astonishingly adaptable, not in an abstract motivational poster way, in the literal, biological, behavioral sense. When the world dried out, they followed the last trickles of water. When the big game animals vanished, they learned to dig for roots, catch fish, crack nuts, trap birds. When one valley failed, they walked to another one. When the familiar patterns of the seasons broke down, they invented new patterns in their heads and adapted their lives to them. They didn't wait for the world to become comfortable. They bent themselves to fit a world that was actively trying to erase them. Every time conditions changed, the fragile, scattered descendants of that bottleneck didn't give up. They shifted their tools, their diets, their social rules. They formed new alliances, new strategies, new stories, over and over, generation after generation, until the world that had nearly killed them finally relaxed its grip. If you strip away the stone tools, the wild landscapes, the saber-toothed cats and giant elephants, that same ability is still sitting quietly in your skull right now. The same nervous system, the same genetic toolkit, the same capacity to notice that something is wrong, to imagine a different way to live, and to change course. That's not just prehistory. That's a survival inheritance. And it matters, because for the first time since that ancient bottleneck, humans are once again living in a world where the word extinction is not just a theoretical possibility. Now, instead of an ice age climate crash, we face a warming world. Our ancestors stared at a sky that refused to rain. We stare at polar ice that refuses to stay frozen. Back then, grasslands vanished and deserts spread. Today, sea levels creep up and heat waves linger over cities built in places where no one asked. What if it gets 2, 3, 4 degrees hotter? Then the threat was natural. volcanic winters, shifting monsoons, slow, grinding changes in Earth's orbit and tilt. Now, the biggest climate threat is us. Billions of descendants of those 1,280 survivors, burning in a few centuries what the planet took millions of years to bury. The parallel is uncomfortable, but it's there. A planet in transition, a climate out of balance, ecosystems under stress, and scattered groups of humans arguing, improvising, trying to figure out how to endure the storm. Our ancestors survived because they became more cooperative, not less. They built networks, shared knowledge, traded tools, exchanged mates across long distances, stitched together a meta-population that could survive local collapses. Today, there are 8 billion of us, not 800 or 8,000. And whether we like it or not, we're also a kind of global meta-population. Cities, nations, cultures, rising, falling, suffering disasters, recovering, while the species as a whole tries to hold itself together. Climate change is only one of the modern hammers. There are others, pandemics, for instance. Our bottleneck ancestors would have known disease very well. Infections from wounds, parasites in water, epidemics that could rip through a tiny band and leave no one behind to remember them. Their defense was small group size, isolation, movement. We live in the opposite world, hyperconnected, dense, fast. A respiratory virus can cross the planet in weeks, riding metal tubes in the sky, yet the same things that make us vulnerable, global travel, huge cities, complex supply chains, also give us a new kind of resilience, science, medicine, real-time data, the ability to create vaccines in months instead of centuries. The Toba eruptions spread ash and darkness across continents. Today, one unknown respiratory virus can spread fear and lockdowns across the globe. But the pattern is familiar. Some groups suffer more, some less. Some adapt quickly, others slowly. We change our behaviors, our technologies, our norms, and gradually, painfully, we learn. Pandemics, climate change, ecological collapse. These are the slow and middling threats. Hanging over them are the more cinematic ones: supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, gamma-ray bursts. Scenarios that sound like science fiction until you remember that once, nearly 900,000 years ago, a real eruption and a real climate crash almost erased the line of ancestors that would become you. The difference is that now we know these things exist. Toba's survivors would have had no concept of a volcano in the way we think of it. Just bad sky, bad ash, bad years. No cause, no physics, no measurements. Today, deep under Yellowstone, under the Phlegraean fields in Italy, under lakes and islands you may never have heard of, magma chambers slowly evolve. And above them, satellites track the slightest swelling of the ground. Seismometers listen to the faintest tremors. Gas sensors sniff at invisible chemical whispers coming from fractures in the rock. Geologists map ancient ash layers and calculate how often truly massive eruptions happen. Space agencies scan the skies for near-Earth asteroids. Climate scientists run models of what would happen if a major eruption injected sunlight-reflecting aerosols into the stratosphere again. We are, in a real sense, the first human generation whose species-wide memory extends not just back into the past, but forward into possible futures. We monitor the kinds of disasters that used to ambush us. We talk about preparedness not just for storms and floods, but for once-in-a-100,000-year events. Human existence is now set on 2 pillars. One is very old, the raw, flexible adaptability carved into us by the bottleneck, the ability to huddle, to move, to change, to try something new when the old strategies stop working. The other is very new: scientific knowledge, global communication, predictive power. Our ancestors had 1 pillar and it was just enough. We have 2. Whether we use both of them wisely is still an open question. And woven through all of this grand planetary thinking is something quieter, more personal, the improbability of you. Imagine a line of ancestors stretching back through time. Your parents, your grandparents, great-grandparents, on and on, doubling at each step, fanning out like branches of a tree until numbers stop making intuitive sense. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who all had to do the same simple, impossible thing. Stay alive long enough to have at least one child who also stayed alive. Now compress that tree, push it backward, past written history, past the first cities, the first farms, past the age of mammoths and cave lions, past the first stone tools in the hands of almost humans. Keep going until you arrive at that narrow throat of time when the entire future of your lineage depends on a few groups of desperate, scattered primates who don't even know what a future is. Every single person alive today is the end point of a chain that passes through that bottleneck. There is no one on Earth whose ancestors simply walked around it. Every living human line squeezed through that same choke point. So when you think about the odds of your own existence, it isn't just the usual thought experiment about all the random meetings, all the chance events that brought your parents together. It's that plus the fact that your line survived a 117,000-year-long coin flip, where extinction was always a possible outcome. Your ancestors didn't have to dodge one disaster. They had to dodge hundreds of thousands of them in a row. Every drought that didn't wipe out your specific line, every predator that failed to catch the person who would someday become the parent of the parent of the parent of you, every bad winter where just enough food was found, every conflict in which your ancestor wasn't the one who died, every birth that was difficult but not quite fatal, every migration that succeeded instead of ending at the edge of an uncrossable canyon or an empty plain. When you trace it back that far, your existence begins to look less like a given and more like an impossibly long series of narrow escapes. If that realization feels heavy, it's because it is. There is a philosophical weight to being descended from such a small, resilient group. It means that your life is perched on top of a towering stack of survival stories, most of them unwritten, unremembered, carried only in your cells. But it also means something lighter, almost comforting. Fragility and resilience are not opposites. They coexist in the same species, in the same brain, in the same beating heart. Our species has been more than once a bad winter away from never existing. And yet the very fact that you're here, listening, means that in all of those bad winters, somebody found enough shelter, enough food, enough courage to keep going. When people talk about human vulnerability today, how exposed we are to climate change, pandemics, systems collapse, they're not wrong. We have built a civilization that is complex, interdependent, sometimes brittle. But underneath the highways, the data centers, the skyscrapers, the satellites, there is still the same animal that crawled through the bottleneck, the one that knows how to survive hard times. Remember, too, that global dominance, our current state with cities on every continent, with machines in orbit and footprints on the moon, was never guaranteed. It is a twist ending no one watching those few thousand survivors scatter across ancient Africa could have predicted. From the outside, they were just one more vulnerable primate clinging to marginal habitats. From the inside, they were something else, carriers of a peculiar combination of traits: cooperation, imagination, language, memory, honed in the tightest evolutionary vise our lineage had ever known. Those traits didn't just get us through. They multiplied. They built myths, tools, farms, cities, telescopes, laboratories. They turned stories told around smoky campfires into stories told through radio waves and fiber optic cables across oceans and entire planets. You are living in a world that exists only because that long-ago bottleneck didn't win. The human journey runs from a handful of scattered bands huddling under unstable skies to 8 billion descendants reshaping the planet itself. From the edge of extinction to, for now, the top of the food chain. The arc is almost absurd in its scale, and yet, lying there, drifting toward sleep, you carry all of it inside you. The fused chromosome from that ancient mutation, the neural wiring polished by 100,000 years of crisis, the language your ancestors slowly wove out of grunts, gestures, shared memories, and dreams. We are not the first generation to face a dangerous world. We are simply the first to do it with the full knowledge of how close we once came to disappearing, and how far we have come since. That knowledge is its own kind of wonder. Somewhere, under volcanoes and ice sheets and deep oceans, the Earth still holds the scars of the catastrophe that nearly erased us. In your body, your mind, your genes, you hold the proof that it didn't. From almost nothing to all of this. So, step back for a moment and trace the whole arc. We began with a planet in chaos, supervolcanoes, wild climate swings, seas rising and falling, ecosystems collapsing. Somewhere in that chaos, the human line is squeezed down to a few thousand breeding adults. Maybe 10,000, maybe 1,280. Whatever the exact number, it was small enough that a single drought, a single epidemic, a single unlucky generation could have erased us forever. Instead, they hung on, tiny bands scattered across a hostile Africa, huddling around fires in dry riverbeds, following shrinking herds across expanding deserts, trading stones, stories, and genes across vast distances to keep their fragile metapopulation alive. Every child born into that world was a gamble. Every winter survived was a victory. From that razor's edge, the story bends upward. Slowly at first, rains return, grasslands creep back, rivers wake up. The population begins to grow, not as one big tribe, but as branching lineages fanning out across continents. Those bottleneck survivors fracture into three paths: the ancestors of modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans spreading into the vastness of Asia and the Pacific. Each group experiments with a different way of being human, different bodies, different tools, different cultures. Yet all of them carry the same deep signature of the crisis: the fused chromosome, the reduced genetic diversity, the neural wiring tuned for problem-solving, cooperation, and adaptation under stress. They meet, they compete, they sometimes kill each other, they sometimes fall in love, they exchange genes, ideas, and maybe even stories about a far-distant time when the human line nearly ended. And eventually one lineage, ours, crosses out of Africa for good. A few hundred people on a shoreline staring across a narrow stretch of water. When they cross, something quiet but irreversible happens. Within tens of thousands of years, their descendants are everywhere. In the Arctic night, in tropical forests, on high plateaus, on islands that can only be reached by boat. The grandchildren of near extinction become a species that blankets the planet. Which means this: every person you've ever met, every face you've ever seen, every language, every culture, every city lit up at night, all of it descends from that thin thread of survivors who refuse to break. You are part of that thread. You carry their story in every cell of your body. The fused chromosome they passed on is curled up right now in your DNA, quietly testifying that your ancestors walked through fire and did not disappear. Your ability to cooperate with strangers, to learn, to teach, to imagine futures that don't exist yet. That's not an accident. It's the result of 117,000 years of evolution under pressure, selecting for minds that could find solutions when there were no easy answers. So when life feels overwhelming, when the world feels unstable, remember the scale of what you come from. Your lineage has survived supervolcano winters, continent-wide droughts, predators, plagues, and the constant threat of simply not making it to the next generation. A bad week, a hard year, even a turbulent century sits inside a much longer story of persistence. You're the living continuation of perhaps 2,000 survivors who refuse to be the last chapter. As you drift towards sleep, you might picture them, a small circle of figures around a fire, sparks rising into a night sky crowded with unfamiliar stars. No cities, no steel, no writing, just the quiet murmur of voices, passing on knowledge that will ripple forward for nearly 1,000,000 years until it reaches you, listening now in a world they could never have imagined, but helped to create simply by staying alive. If this journey through deep time has kept you company tonight, you can gently let the details fade and hold on to the feeling instead. Gratitude, maybe, or a kind of quiet wonder that you exist at all. That out of all the possible timelines, you're in the one where humanity made it through. If you'd like more stories like this, more hidden chapters of our past told slowly for nights like this, you can tap like on this video or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If you're awake enough, you can even leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, adding one more point of light to that global web that began with a handful of scattered bands in ancient Africa. And if you feel called to support this project a little more, there's an optional channel membership here on YouTube. Totally up to you. Your presence, your time, your curiosity are already more than enough. For now, thank you for walking this long road with me, from the edge of extinction to the modern world, one quiet minute at a time. Rest well, descendant of survivors. The torch they carried is in your hands now.